For now, let me move on to highlighting the nuclear liability piece of the bill. Here, the impetus for legislating a change lies in the fact that the existing liability limit of $75 million was created to support industry in the 1950s. It is so low that international courts simply wouldn't recognize it. So in order to boost foreign investment in nuclear power in Canada, a legislative change was needed. That process began in 2008, and this is now the 5th time that the Conservatives have brought in a bill to try to deal with its woefully inadequate liability scheme. To its credit, this bill does propose to increase the maximum liability for operators of nuclear installations for damage resulting from a nuclear accident by more than the earlier iterations of this bill. Whereas the Conservatives once thought that an increase from $75 million to $650 million per nuclear installation would suffice, Bill C-22 raises it to $1 billion. While that is certainly a step in the right direction, even this limit seems shamefully low when we consider the consequences of a nuclear accident. As Greenpeace bluntly points out, the current nuclear liability conventions are intended to protect the nuclear industry and do not offer sufficient compensation to victims. From the beginning of the use of nuclear power to produce electricity 60 years ago, the nuclear industry has been protected from paying the full cost of its failures. Governments have created a system that protects the benefits of companies, while those who suffer from nuclear disasters end up paying the costs. It is for precisely that reason that even the Fraser Institute, which no one would accuse of being a left-wing think tank, is arguing for more draconian action. Joel Wood, senior research economist at the Fraser Institute, had this to say on nuclear liability caps. Increasing the cap only decreases the subsidy. It does not eliminate it. The Government of Canada should proceed with legislation that removes the liability cap entirely, rather than legislation that maintains it or increases it to be harmonious with other jurisdictions. In other words, Mr. Speaker, both Greenpeace and the Fraser Institute agree that the bill before us today continues with the tradition of protecting corporations rather than protecting Canadian citizens. So let's look at the liability caps and evaluate them. It seems obvious that the total liability will not be able to cover a medium-sized accident, never mind a catastrophic one. A nuclear accident will cause billions of dollars in damage and personal injuries, death, and contamination of the surrounding areas. The Japanese government is now saying that the cost of the nuclear disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi plant will be over $250 billion. And according to the Director of Environmental Governance for the Pembina Institute, a major accident at the Darlington, Ontario nuclear plant east of Toronto, which is very near to my own riding of Hamilton Mountain, could cause damage in the range of an estimated $1 trillion. $1 billion doesn't even come close to being adequate, and taxpayers will be on the hook for the difference. The U.S., on the other hand, has a cap of $10 billion. Germany, which has experienced the fallout of the Chernobyl meltdown, has an unlimited amount. Many other countries are also moving in that direction toward an unlimited amount of liability. Does the government really believe that Canadian lives, properties, and communities are worth less than those of our U.S. and European counterparts? Judging by this legislation, one would think the answer is yes. Perhaps more than anything else, this bill and the debate around it highlight the outrageous costs and potentially devastating risks of nuclear energy, particularly when we compare it to greener, more sustainable alternatives. For example, the 3 Mile Island incident outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in 1979 was a relatively minor nuclear accident, but it cost an estimated $975 million for the cleanup investigation. To put the absolute enormity of these costs into context, for the cost of cleaning up 3 Mile Island, 1,147,058 100-watt solar panels could have been bought and assembled. The total subsidies for Canada's state-owned nuclear company, AECL, from 1952 to the year 2000 were approximately $16 billion. This is money that could be spent investigating safer methods of energy. But the enormous costs do not just apply when things go bad. The planned construction costs for the third Fermi plant in Michigan will cost an estimated $10 billion US and take approximately 6 years to complete. The price of wind power, on the other hand, is dropping fast and can even be had for as low as 11 cents per kilowatt hour right now. Imagine the cost savings to taxpayers and the lower electricity bills for seniors and hard-working families if we could shift to cheaper, safer, and more sustainable power. On top of the financial expenses, nuclear energy in general is extremely unsafe, both to the environment and to human life. There can be no doubt that Canada needs a greener approach in terms of power. In fact, statistics show that Canada ranks 11th in a poll measuring wind power capacity. If Canada expects to be seen as a leader in the world, we need to compete in the field of clean, renewable energy. Now, that's a topic I would love to go on at some length, but with only a few minutes more available to me here in this debate, let me return again to the text of the bill before us today and highlight a few other changes that the bill entails. If the bill passes this time, C-22 will allow Canada to ratify the convention it signed in December of 2013, called the International Convention on Supplementary Compensation for Nuclear Damage. That convention would establish nuclear civil liability treaty relations with the U.S., which is already a party to the convention. Important here is that this provides access to supplemental compensation from an international pool of up to $500 million if that were ever to be needed by convention participants. Domestically, the bill expands the range of damages that can be claimed, and it will triple to 30 years the length of time a person can wait to make a claim for latent illnesses. While this is an improvement, it is clearly not enough. The Chernobyl disaster is now more than 25 years in the past already, and the other report on Chernobyl, which was done by 2 British scientists in 2006, predicted between 30,000 and 60,000 excess cancer deaths, while the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear Warfare estimated that more than 50,000 cases of thyroid cancer are still being expected. Obviously, in light of this evidence, the 30-year statute of limitations is something that we on this side of the House would want to examine more closely in committee. A few other points about C-22 are also of note. First, let me point out a provision that's missing entirely from this bill. C-22 does not cover any accidents outside of the nuclear plant setting. Oil and mining companies and medical facilities use radioactive materials as well, but they are not liable for any accidents related to their use or disposal. Excuse me. I think that is a gaping hole in this bill, a hole that we must try to fill in committee. Either we are serious about protecting Canadians or we are not. I certainly know whose side I am on. And while I'm on the topic of reviewing this bill in committee, let me remind my colleagues on the government side of the House that the Canadian Environmental Law Association had requested the federal government to undertake a meaningful public consultation on how the Nuclear Liability Act should be modernized to acknowledge lessons from the Fukushima disaster. Instead, Natural Resources Canada has been privately consulting Canadian nuclear operators on how to revise the NLA. This behind closed doors consultation with industry is completely unacceptable. The NLA transfers the financial risk for reactor operations from industry to Canadians. It is imperative, therefore, that Canadians be consulted. Now, the former Minister of Natural Resources, who now serves as the Finance Minister, did promise that there would be plenty of time for consultation with the public. He said, and I quote, "Once a bill is introduced, members of Parliament will have the opportunity to call witnesses before committee to provide comment and debate the legislation line by line. I trust that the new Minister of Natural Resources will honour his colleagues' commitment and that he will not cave in to his House leader's draconian predisposition to shut down all debate. But as always, the proof will be in the pudding, and I don't expect that we will get a clear answer on that here today. So let me return now to the bill itself. I do want to point out a few other provisions. The bill does set up a quasi-judicial claims tribunal which, if needed, will handle damage claims in the event of an accident. Secondly, the bill stipulates that only half the billion-dollar liability coverage for nuclear operators will have to be covered using traditional insurance. Operators will be allowed to put up other forms of financial security for the remaining $500 million. Excuse me. Third, it is the Government of Canada that will provide some of the coverage for lower-risk nuclear facilities, such as smaller research reactors. And lastly, it bears pointing out that the bill mandates a review of liability amounts at least once every 5 years. While the 5-year review is certainly an important safety valve in giving Parliament the opportunity to reevaluate the adequacy of the $1 billion liability limit down the road, I think it's important that we do our level best to get it right the first time. It's our job as legislators to protect the interests of Canadians. And frankly, if the government is so convinced that nuclear power is a mature industry, then it's an industry that can and must pay for itself. Instead, this bill is just one more corporate handout by making taxpayers liable for nuclear risk. Taxpayers shouldn't be on the hook for subsidies to nuclear energy over other renewable power sources. Other countries certainly seem to agree with me on that, and have decided that their citizens deserve much higher protection in the event of a nuclear accident. Why will the Conservatives not offer Canadians that same protection? Let me wrap up by reiterating my bottom line on this bill. First, if the government truly believes in the polluter pay principle, then taxpayers should not hold the risk for these energy projects. Secondly, if we measure risk correctly and assign liability, then industry will improve its safety practices, reducing the likelihood of catastrophic accidents. Thirdly, we have to study global best practices and ensure that the federal government puts Canadians first. Fourth, the Canadian government should prepare a comprehensive assessment of the risks posed by nuclear power plant operations in Canada, the opportunities for reducing that risk, and the accompanying risk costs and risk reduction costs. Fifth, we must engage publicly with a wide range of stakeholders to discuss risks and options to improve nuclear liability in Canada. We must have comprehensive public hearings into this bill. And sixth, we must review the liability regime regularly moving forward to make sure our laws are up to date. It is completely unacceptable that successive Conservative and Liberal governments have waited decades to address this. Canadians deserve so much better than that. So let me just conclude, Mr. Speaker, by saying this. While the bill before us today talks about who will clean up after an accident, what Canadians really deserve is a government that puts their interests first. And that means a government that understands that what we need is an offshore nuclear liability regime that focuses on ensuring that these kinds of disasters never happen in the first place. That is real leadership, and that's the kind of leadership Canadians can expect when they elect an NDP government in 2015. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.